So, why do you need to learn how to create different versions or different looks out of just one picture? It's not like you're going to post that picture all over the internet on your different profiles and platforms and get away with people thinking that it's a different picture. No, it's the same picture. But the reason why you need to learn this is because it actually gives you a really important skill. And that skill is being able to create different looks or a theme or a vibe even for a website or even like an Instagram profile. If you have a look online, when you visit a website, you'll notice it has a certain color scheme or a certain theme to it that gives it all some form of uniformity. It makes it more pleasing for the person viewing the website to think, okay, this is what this website or business is about. And likewise, when you visit Instagram pages, 9 times out of 10, the ones that are really doing well will have a consistent look to them. Their color scheme will be very similar. Their editing style will be quite uniform across all their pictures. Now, learning a skill like this isn't easy, but once you do learn it, trust me, you'll find a way to manipulate a photo so that you can create whatever look you want out of it, whether it's for a client or for your own post, whatever it may be. You'll be able to manipulate it to a point where you can say, okay, you want a vintage look? I'll give it a vintage look. You wanted that HDR look? No problem. You want to give it that cinematic look? There's a way to do it, and I know how. And the reason why I've done this video is because I want to teach you guys exactly how you can create a look like this in Lightroom. Let's jump right in. Now, if you're new to Lightroom, don't worry, because what I'm about to show you is pretty basic in terms of how to manipulate a photo and create a certain look. I'm not going too into completely changing a photo, but if you do still want to learn the basics of Lightroom, then once you open it up, you should be able to see this section up here where it says Learn and Discover. You can actually see loads of different tutorials and how-tos, just essentials that you would need to learn how to use Lightroom to its best advantage. So yeah, definitely have a look there, learn and discover. But let's head back to the photo that I want to work with to show you the different versions that I can create with it. And that's actually from a shoot that I did when I went to Amsterdam recently with a couple of friends of mine. So this here is actually a simple, raw, unedited image that I've imported into Lightroom. And the reason why I chose this picture because it's actually got quite a lot of dynamic range in it. You've got a lot of darker tones, reflections in the sky and the water. It's quite a lot of detail in it, so it's actually pretty difficult to work with. But I chose that for a reason, because I wanted to show you guys how easy it is to just change the look without changing the quality of the picture. So right here is what I would consider a decently composed picture, and it's exposed reasonably well. The sky's obviously blown out to allow for some of these darker areas to show detail, but we can always bring that back later. And I've actually got a few versions saved here, and I want to show you exactly how I've achieved them. So the first one here is what I like to call dual tone. Now, dual tone, essentially you'll see on all these really like attractive Instagram profiles, the ones that you're double tapping all day long because you just love the look that they've given to their entire page. And a lot of Instagram profiles actually copy and paste this effect. They save this essential preset and they just use it on all their photos, as long as they've exposed them correctly when they're shooting them raw. Now, I am editing this image as a raw image. Now, working with JPEGs, yes, it's possible, but you don't have as much freedom. A lot of the sort of colors and tones and highlights and shadows are kind of baked into the JPEG image, whereas this one with a raw image, you've got a lot more flexibility. You can play around with the image a lot more and not lose detail, and that's the most important part here. If you're manipulating an image, you don't want to lose detail. Moving on, I've created a sort of vintage look. Now, this is a seriously vintage look, something that maybe would have been taken in like the 1940s, maybe the 1950s, and I actually got inspiration from this photo for this photo from seeing one of my grandparents' photo albums. I looked at these and all of their photos had this sort of washed out vintage look. There was no obviously color back in those days, but they had this sort of haziness to them around the outside where the lens or the camera at the time just couldn't pick up the details in the edges of the pictures, and I've kind of created that same sort of look here. And around in the middle of the image you've got a lot more focus, and it's just that sort of sepia tone to the entire image. Now, completely switching the scales, this is what I like to call my version of a HDR look. Now, HDR stands for high dynamic range. So essentially what you're getting here is a lot of detail in the shadows and a lot of detail in the highlights. Again, as I shot the image, the sky was blown out, so it will remain blown out. If I want to keep the rest of this detail here in the corners, especially down here in the middle across the bridge with all these little details of the bike, the windows and the trees. So this high dynamic range image boosts the colors, it boosts the details, and you've got a lot less sort of difference between the highlights and the shadows. They've all sort of come back to sort of one plane to seem a lot more in your face. The next one is what I like to call a cinematic look. Now, cinematic look, I hate when people use that term, but there's a reason why we use that term. It's because it sort of gives it that teal and orange classic film look. Now, not all film looks have the same look, not even all of them use teal and orange. What I've done here with this film look is kind of gone for a bit more of a darker, grungy, deeper tone, but still keeping some of those warm highlights in there. This type of look you'll probably find in a lot more sort of darker, gloomy, moodier type of films, and that's the kind of image I wanted to give to it, to give that some drama and some sort of theatric to the actual image. And by using this color scheme of warm highlights and darker shadows or cooler shadows, you're creating this film look. And I've also introduced some kind of a fade. As you can see in here, these shadow areas, there's a sort of grayed, washed out look, and by doing that you're flattening the image a little bit where people can focus more on the midtones and the highlights. And finally, moving across to black and white. Now, there's a million different ways that you can do black and white, and what I've done here is a pretty simple sort of high contrast black and white. I didn't want to completely ruin the image and go way over with the black and white, and you can do that if you sort of fade out the blacks like I did in the previous image. But I think black and white remains quite a tasteful image if it's done correctly. You don't want it to be too in your face. It needs to be still slightly muted and have a bit of drama to the image, and that is something which I've done here with the black and white. So we're going to track back right to the beginning, back to the original, so you can see where we go from here to create all these different looks. Now, I'm going to start off with the orange and black. Now, the orange and black, as you can see here, I've given it a little bit of manipulation here in the light section. Now, the light section here essentially allows me to control the highlights, the shadows, the brightest part of the image, the whites, and the darkest part of the image, the blacks, and essentially the overall composure. Now, the reason why I've dropped the highlights entirely is because if you look here, I can bring the detail back in from the sky. You see more of the branches come back into detail, and down here I've introduced an ever so slight curve to the image. So this here allows me to manipulate how faded those, gone too far, how faded those blacks look. And I've ended up at a look around here because I still want to fade out some of those blacks, because there's a lot more black in this image now that I've desaturated all of the other colors. And moving down here, I haven't played too much with the vibrance and saturation of the global image. This affects the whole image, whereas this affects just the colors in the image individually. Now you can see here, to create the sort of orange look to everything, the image is now changed from having the yellow leaves to orange leaves, and I've done that by shifting the color of everything over to orange. The orange stays where it is and the yellows go over to orange. I've increased the saturation, and now look at all the other colors. I've reduced the saturation of every single other color so that it creates this black and orange look. Now bear in mind, you don't just have to stick with black and orange, you can do this with any color in the image. I chose orange because I wanted to keep it warm, but trust me, you can do this with anything as long as any of these colors are present. I've not completely changed the overall color grade of the image, and by grading, what you're generally doing is affecting the shadows, the midtones and the highlights of the image. The shadows, I've ever so slightly made them blue. If my highlights, all these lights and all these trees and everything are going to be orange, I need to choose an opposing color, which is the reason why I've chosen the blue. And then over here, down in the bottom, I've created a few tiny effects to the image. And the first one is increasing the texture. I wanted more textures down here in the ripples of the water, in the bicycle wheels, in the trees up here, and especially the windows. I wanted to see more detail there. So by introducing more texture, I've done exactly that. And what I've also done is I've increased the clarity of the image here as well. So by increasing the brighter areas and by decreasing the darker areas, I've introduced more contrast to the entire image. And the reason why I've done that is because without that contrast, just having two colors means the image will remain flat. So I've introduced more depth and more drama to the image by increasing the clarity. Dehazing allows the image to essentially dehaze. I've reduced the amount of blowout or light that is created from reflections and lights such as these that cause haze on the lens. And I've created a dehazing effect to bring more detail into the image. And finally, a classic amongst most photographers, a slight vignette. And this is a darkening of the image around the corners here. So you'll notice this part of the image is darker than it is here. We've got a big vignette here. What that essentially does is give you a focus area on the image of where to look. It's telling the viewer where you want to direct their attention. So that vignette is essentially doing that by darkening the corners of the image. And you can manipulate the vignette to have a really small effect or a really large effect. That's completely up to you. But that's essentially how I've created this orange and black look. Now flipping over, let's take this right back to the top to the vintage photo. Now the vintage photo, you'll see what I've done here. I've had to keep everything relatively flat. I didn't want to create much contrast or drama in the image. So by not manipulating these sections too much of the light, I've kept it so that the sky remains blown out. There's a little bit more flatness to this image here. And if you'll notice on the curve, there's a lot more going on than in the previous image. And what I've done here is I've really bumped up the fade in the bottom blacks to make them look almost grey, and you can see here they look grey, especially in the corners and the deeper blacks of the image. And also I wanted the top end of the image, the whites, to also fade out. Back in the days, the cameras didn't have enough power to really get the detail in the highlights and the shadows. So by doing that and that, I'm mimicking what an old camera would have been able to pick up. And also down here, you'll see I've changed the black and white mixer. So you can change the essential white balance of a picture, but you can also change the black and white of an image. And I've changed those hues and saturations of the warmer tones to these values here, and the blue cooler tones to these values here. And what that's done is given it that sepia look. But on top of that, I also wanted to create a glow or a global color grade to the image as well. So in my shadows, I've introduced warmth. So you can see here they're stained that sort of reddish orange color. And also in my highlights, I've introduced the warmth as well. So the whole image has a global sort of sepia, warm, saturated tone. And back down to the effects. Now the final thing, I didn't want more texture. Remember, the image needs to stay flat. So by keeping the texture where it is, the image stays flat. But because I've reduced and flattened everything in the image from all my other effects up here, I needed to bring back in some clarity. So I've again changed this back up to a higher value, so you've got more clarity in the water and along the buildings and the bicycles here, just to bring out enough detail so the person can see what this image is doing. And that is essentially how I've created the vintage look. And finally, I move over to the HDR. Now this is a relatively simple thing to do. All you want to do is make sure that your highlights are turned way down and your shadows are turned way up, so you're essentially squeezing these 2 points here closer to the middle. Now traditionally that would be there, that would be there, and these 2 peaks would be much further apart, but I've brought them closer together. And what that's done here is you can see there's a lot more interesting detail in this image that wasn't there before. And I've done that by simply just increasing the shadows and decreasing the highlights. I've reduced the black so that there's more sort of drama in the deeper areas here, and so that you get a little bit more contrast in the image. I've not changed any of the curves here because again it's all done up here using the light bars here. I've changed the saturation so that you get more vibrance as well. So you've boosted that, and you get more detail and drama out of the image by just creating that little bit of increase in vibrance and saturation. I've played a little bit with the hues over here, and not too much because again all the colors are naturally there and I didn't want to affect them too much, and that's just changed a little bit of the warmth of the image. I wanted more of these lights to be brighter and warmer. And again, I've done no color grading here, so I wanted the colors to stay true to what they are, what the camera was actually picking up when it took the original image. Again, by increasing all of these and changing them to the values they should be for a HDR effect, you don't need to play too much with the other effects. So no vignetting, no dehazing, clarity has been increased ever so slightly, and I haven't needed to add any more texture. So an HDR effect can be simply created just by using your light functions right up here. Finally, another one, cinematic. Now this one does require quite a lot of manipulation to create a look. Now what I've done here is I've played around again, creating those sort of HDR style looks, but because I've changed the contrast, because I've changed the whites and the black, you can't see much of a HDR look as in the previous image. I've increased the black point so that you introduce a fade here in the image. You can see that in all the dark parts of the image. And what I've also done is now color graded the image. So this is something that professional colorists do for all the films that you would see on TV. Even TV shows nowadays that you're watching on Netflix are all color graded, and that is affecting the image as a global sort of asset. You're changing the whole image. So my shadows are in that teal area, my midtones are also in that teal area. I wanted a really cool effect to the image, and then my highlights are actually warmer. So my light bulbs and my trees and the sun's glow on that boat are all warmer. Again, not much point needed to change the texture. I wanted the image flat to create that cinematic look, and you can see here I've increased a vignette amount, and that again has given you that sort of darker corners of the image, telling you where to look as a viewer of this image. Finally, black and white. It's pretty simple but pretty complicated. Back to the top here, again I've created that HDR look, because remember, when you're creating a black and white image, if you keep it flat there will be less drama to the image, and by increasing the shadows and decreasing the highlights you're bringing that detail back in. And I've reduced the contrast because otherwise the darks will be too dark and the lights will be too light. The blacks, again, I've reduced them down all the way to the black point so they remain black. I want a true black and white image. I've messed with this ever so slightly to create a very soft S-curve. Now an S-curve is something that you'll see quite often when editing photos. It creates that sort of look where your highlights are boosted and your shadows are brought down a little bit to create more contrast in the image. And all I've done here is brought the vibrance and saturation all the way down to 0. By doing that, you've eliminated any color in the image, and all you're working with is the light functions and your curves. Again, no color grading required, and you can play around with the textures here if needed. So I needed less detail in the image, so what I did was I reduced the clarity and I reduced the texture so that the detail in the image is muted, and I'm only working with the detail up here in the light section. So essentially, that is how you create 5 different looks for an image from just one. I hope that video helped you guys. I hope it gave you an idea of how to manipulate an image to a point that you can create different looks out of it, and I hope you actually use this to create some sort of a theme for your Instagram profile or your website or any type of publication you're doing, because it really helps when you understand how to manipulate an image to the point that it can continue on as a theme for all your other images to follow. Now, these are just 5 looks. I know there are 100 different looks that you could do for an image, but these are the bare bones understanding how to create a certain look for an image. So that's me done pretty much, guys. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. That really helps the channel. Share it with other people that might be interested. Drop a comment below if you have any questions. I'll be happy to answer. And if you really want to see more of this stuff, consider subscribing. I'm going to be doing a lot more tutorials and things like that related to film and photo in the future. It is a passion of mine, and I want to keep sharing that with you guys. My next video should be out pretty soon. I'm working on it right now. Thanks for joining me on the ride on this one, and I hope to see you on the next one. Peace.